A chilly December morning in 2014 began with an unusual disturbance on Ridley Street, north of Newcastle. 6 unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of the 2-story house where Christopher Hale had lived quietly for nearly a decade. Neighbors peeked through curtain gaps as tactically geared officers fanned out to surround the area. Inside, 46-year-old Christopher was preparing his morning cup of tea, a habit he had maintained consistently since leaving the Tyne Wear Fire Service. A rapid knock sounded at 6:41 a.m. Christopher Hale, Northumbria Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 2005 disappearance of Ava Linton. The officers later described how his hand trembled slightly as he set down the teapot, but his face remained unnervingly calm, as if he had known this morning would come, and that the truth had finally arrived at his door. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In 2005, Newcastle upon Tyne was a city with 2 contrasting rhythms, bustling with activity and commerce by day, and at night draped in an atmosphere blending revelry, alcohol, and the quiet wariness of those accustomed to a city with an endless nightlife. The quayside area was then the cultural and entertainment hub of Newcastle, where bars, clubs, and restaurants crowded together under lights reflecting off the River Tyne. The sounds of music, laughter, and footsteps along the riverbank formed a signature soundtrack that anyone living there knew by heart. In that setting, Ava Linton, a 28-year-old woman working at a bar on the quayside, was used to finishing her shifts when most streets were starting to empty. Her job required her to leave late, when the glow from neon signs began to fade, leaving only the characteristic yellow light from street lamps stretching up the slope to Grey Street. Ava lived in Jesmond, a quiet residential area a few minutes' drive or a longer walk from the city center. To save money and maintain a regular routine, she often chose to walk home after each shift, crossing the familiar sloping roads connecting the quayside to the northern parts of the city. That night, Newcastle wore its familiar guise, groups of friends stumbling out of pubs with unsteady laughter, a few taxis cruising slowly along the riverbank, looking for fares, and the chill from the water seeping into narrow alleys, making the air damp and biting. Ava, as usual, finished her shift, said goodbye to colleagues, and stepped outside, blending into the city's slow-breathing late-night rhythm. There was nothing unusual in her actions. No hurry, no tension, just the typical fatigue after hours of serving customers. Quayside area cameras captured Ava heading toward Grey Street, her pace steady and subdued. The route to Jesmond wasn't far, but it included many poorly lit areas, especially at intersections between main streets and small slopes. It was also an area that many locals often avoided walking alone late at night, even though the city wasn't always considered dangerous. As the clock ticked through the final hours of the night, life in the homes of her loved ones began entering a phase of worry. Her housemate realized Ava hadn't returned, though she should have been home before dawn. The first calls were just routine checks, but the more they called, the more Ava's silence became unusual. The whole family tried contacting her one by one, but all attempts failed. The phone went unanswered. Messages got no reply. No one knew where Ava was, and there were no signs she had changed plans or left Newcastle. By the time morning fully broke, the family's worry had turned into palpable tension. They knew that a prolonged absence in such circumstances was something that had never happened with Ava. After checking all the familiar places she might have stopped, but finding no trace, the family decided to contact the police to report that Ava Linton was missing. In a city that always shifted with the pulse of the night, the sudden disappearance of a young woman quickly became a simmering unease, starting with her family and gradually spreading to those closest to her, opening up a series of questions no one could answer right away. When the call was transferred to Northumbria Police that morning, the information was immediately forwarded to the on-duty unit handling missing persons cases across the area. From the moment Ava's name was entered into the log, the case was quickly moved into the initial assessment process to determine the level of risk. The duty officer asked the family a series of basic questions Ava's age, daily habits, work schedule, recent mental state, close relationships, possibility of voluntary departure, and especially the fact that Ava was the mother of a young child living with the family. This information formed the basis for evaluating whether the disappearance fit predictable patterns. The file showed Ava was 28, had stable employment, no signs of stress leading to voluntary leaving, no history of prolonged loss of contact, and most importantly, she had never left home without informing loved ones of her whereabouts. The fact that she had a 4-year-old daughter she cared for regularly was a key factor indicating the likelihood of voluntary departure was virtually zero. Based on all the data, police classified Ava's case as a high-risk adult missing, a high-risk level, requiring rapid response and proactive investigation. This classification was significant because it allowed police to prioritize resources and transfer the file to the Missing Persons Investigation Unit, where experienced officers handled cases requiring deep analysis of behavior and context. Once the file was activated, the investigation team was assigned, consisting of a lead investigator and a secondary investigator, supported by the Data Analysis Department and local police handling the Quayside and Jesmond areas. Their first goal was to gather as much information as possible in the time before and after Ava left work, since every passing minute reduced the chances of finding remaining traces. The team identified 4 initial priority directions. First, reconstructing Ava's movement timeline to determine the last point she was seen and the period of lost contact. Second, reviewing Ava's social environment, including family, friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have had close contact. Third, assessing external risk factors related to the route Ava usually took, especially dimly lit or isolated areas. And finally, considering the possibility of a medical emergency or unwitnessed accident. These directions were not meant to confirm the nature of the case, but to ensure no possibility was overlooked in the early stage. Meanwhile, the team also created a full descriptive profile of Ava: height, weight, clothing when leaving the bar, identifying features, and any information the public might need if a widespread search appeal was issued. All these steps were carried out in the first few hours, laying the groundwork for later data analysis. Ava's traceless disappearance in a bustling city forced police to treat every smallest detail seriously, as even a gap in the timeline could hide a critical development. From this point, Ava's file officially became a high-priority missing person case, requiring the investigation team to quickly collect all possible information to reconstruct her final hours before vanishing. Immediately afterward, the investigation team moved to gathering information directly from the last place Ava was seen, focusing on the bar where she worked. Investigators met with the manager and Ava's colleagues to obtain detailed statements about her shift the night before she disappeared. Coworkers confirmed Ava finished later than usual due to a busy crowd, but no one noticed anything unusual in her attitude or behavior. Ava conversed normally, showed no signs of stress or haste, and did not mention meeting anyone after her shift. The last colleague to see Ava was the one cleaning the bar, who said Ava only mentioned feeling a bit tired and wanting to go home to rest. After solidifying information from witnesses, police began checking the CCTV systems around the Quayside area. In 2005, the city's CCTV network was not as integrated as it would become later, but there were still enough cameras at intersections, turns, and busy areas. The team collected numerous footage segments from cameras near the bar and routes leading toward Jesmond. First, they focused on the camera right outside the bar, where Ava exited after finishing her shift. From there, footage showed Ava walking alone along the riverbank, heading toward the ascent to Dean Street, moving to the next camera at the intersection of Dean Street and the slope up to Grey Street. They noted Ava appearing a few minutes later, walking steadily with no one closely following in frame. Her walking alone was key to ruling out the possibility of leaving the bar with a stranger immediately, but the images weren't wide enough to identify people outside the camera range. From Grey Street onward, cameras became sparser, especially on small paths and slopes with little monitoring. The team reviewed all public and accessible private cameras, including those from late-closing shops and restaurants. However, only part of Ava's journey was captured. After the final intersection with a camera at the top of Gray Street, no further images confirmed she continued toward Jesmond. This was a major gap in the timeline, creating a period of time and space where police could not determine where Ava went or whom she encountered. Nevertheless, by piecing together colleague statements, camera data, and Ava's nightly travel habits, the team initially formed a basic timeline. Ava finished late, left the bar alone, walked along the quayside up Dean Street, and continued to Gray Street along her usual route to Jesmond. These facts reinforced the premise that Ava did not change plans that night. However, the lack of any camera capturing her journey after the final point left the timeline preliminary and incomplete. Police realized they needed more than images and statements to fill this critical gap, as the moment Ava left camera view was when all possibilities opened up, requiring the investigation to expand to factors beyond the route. From that need, the investigation team shifted to interviewing family and those close to Ava to clarify her personal context in the days before disappearing. Investigators prioritized answering the most important question, whether Ava had any reason or plan to leave Newcastle that night. The family firmly stated Ava had no travel plans. She mentioned no sudden trips, prepared no luggage, made no arrangements to leave her daughter with others outside the usual schedule, and showed no signs of wanting to quit her job or current home. They emphasized that Ava always stayed in close contact with loved ones, especially due to her responsibility for her young child, so suddenly vanishing without a message was inconsistent with her personality and habits. When asked about personal relationships, family and friends all mentioned the ongoing tension between Ava and her ex-husband, Christopher Hale. Though they were separated, and Ava had moved to Jesmond, the two still interacted regarding their shared daughter. According to loved ones, Christopher had become more unpredictable recently, showing frustration over child care arrangements, and had behaviors that made Ava feel weary, avoiding unnecessary conversations. Ava's friends also said she rarely shared personal matters, but whenever Christopher was mentioned, Ava often appeared tense and wanted to change the subject. However, no one had evidence of an argument or serious incident between them right before Ava disappeared. What drew investigators' attention more was information from one of Ava's close friends, who said that in recent weeks, Ava had expressed concern about someone following her. She didn't specify who or describe situations in detail, just saying she sometimes felt watched while walking from Quayside to Jesmond late at night. Ava was described as someone who didn't exaggerate or imagine things, so this worry stuck with friends and made them uneasy when recounting it to police. A few relatives had also heard Ava mention seeing unfamiliar faces repeatedly near her home area, but Ava offered no clear theory on whether it related to her. These fragments of information, though not enough for conclusions, helped police recognize that Ava's unease was not isolated but ongoing. When compiling all statements, the team began building a circle of proximity, the group of people with close contact, direct or indirect influence on Ava's daily life. The list included family, colleagues, close friends, landlord, housemates, Christopher Hale, and any individuals mentioned in statements who might appear near her home or workplace. Although most on the list had natural connections to Ava without clear motives, listing and categorizing was crucial to identify who needed deeper interviews or behavior monitoring. This work also allowed police to narrow external factors potentially affecting Ava's safety, including individuals Ava noticed or felt unsafe around near her home. By the end of this interview round, the team had a clearer picture of Ava's social life, stable, but with multiple stress factors, especially related to the ended relationship, and a vague sense of being followed that she never got to explain in detail. Although there was no concrete evidence yet of criminal activity, the gathered statements provided an important foundation for the next investigation step, where police had to narrow the timeline gap by cross-referencing all data with the route Ava likely took. Based on that request, the investigation team decided to proceed with a field sweep along the exact route that camera footage and witness statements indicated Ava commonly used from Quayside to Jesmond. This was a short but complex route, consisting of multiple steep sections, small intersections, short flights of stairs, side alleys, and areas with poor lighting. The purpose of the search was not only to look for signs that Ava had passed through, but also to detect any of her belongings that might have been dropped, discarded, or dragged in an unintended situation. The search team was divided into multiple groups, each responsible for a different section of terrain, starting from the last point where cameras captured Ava at the top of Gray Street. From there, they moved upward toward the slopes leading to Jesmond, thoroughly checking both sides of the road, as well as the side paths that pedestrians sometimes used to shorten the distance. Less frequented spots, such as old staircases, bicycle paths cutting through small parks, and areas under the bridge leading to Ouseburn Valley, were all examined carefully with flashlights and detection tools. While most of the initial route showed no particular signs, one search group, as it approached the Ouseburn Valley area, discovered an object lying off to the side of a trail, not far from the main path, but difficult to notice from a normal distance. Upon closer inspection, the team recognized it as a personal item identified as belonging to Ava, based on prior descriptions from her family. This discovery was significant because it was the first piece of physical evidence to appear since Ava's disappearance, and its location. Not in the central quayside area, but in the transitional zone between residential areas and the valley, suggested that she might have deviated from her usual route or been forced to change direction. Based on the find location, the investigation team expanded the search perimeter around it, thoroughly sweeping the rugged terrain of Ouseburn Valley, where there were dense bushes, obscured trails, and muddy ground from the previous night's rain. They marked the entire area as a zone of interest, not ruling out the possibility that Ava had been approached there, or that the item had fallen while she was being followed, or trying to move faster than usual. Although there were no clear signs of a struggle, the fact that one of Ava's personal belongings appeared far from the main route was enough to alert police that this could be the site of a significant incident. In the context of a missing person case lacking data, the item's location provided investigative direction, helping police better visualize Ava's final segment of travel and the environmental factors that might have affected her safety. After designating the zone of interest, the forensics team was called in to secure the scene. They established protective boundaries with police tape, minimizing external intrusion, to preserve any remaining traces. The forensic specialists began photographing the scene from multiple angles, documenting the exact position of the evidence, noting lighting conditions, terrain, humidity, vegetation density, and any features that might be relevant to later analysis. Samples of soil, leaves, fabric fibers caught on branches, and impressions on the ground were all collected for storage, even though it could not yet be determined if they were directly related to Ava. This collection was carried out according to standard procedures, ensuring every sample was numbered, packaged, and logged with full details of location, time, and environmental conditions at the time of collection. In the subsequent sweep, the investigation team tried to determine the most likely direction Ava might have taken for the item to end up in this area. They evaluated both possibilities: that Ava turned into Ouseburn Valley on her own, or that she was influenced from behind, causing her or her belongings to leave the main road. The investigators also noted that this area was typically sparsely populated late at night, with complex terrain featuring many hidden spots, making it entirely plausible for an incident to occur without witnesses. Once the scene was fully secured, all evidence was transferred to the analysis lab for the next steps. For the investigation team, finding Ava's belonging was the most important breakthrough since the case began. It pinpointed a key point in her journey and raised new questions about what happened there during the time period when cameras no longer captured her movements. From this location, police had additional grounds to adjust the search scope and reevaluate information gathered from cameras, statements, and Ava's movement context on the night she vanished without a trace in a bustling yet shadowy Newcastle, full of unpredictable hidden corners. After recovering the first piece of evidence in the Ouseburn Valley area and determining it could be a critical point in Ava's final journey, the investigation team shifted focus to clarifying her closest relationships with Christopher Hale, her ex-husband, and someone who interacted regularly with Ava due to shared responsibility for their daughter, being prioritized for early summoning. The investigators approached Christopher at the Tyne Wear Fire Station, where he was on shift, to gather his statement about his whereabouts, activities, and any interactions with Ava on the day she went missing. Christopher stated that he was on night duty at the time Ava left the bar, and according to him, he did not leave the station throughout his shift, except for assigned internal tasks. He asserted that he had not seen Ava in the 24 to 48 hours before her disappearance and had no plans to contact or meet her that evening. The investigation team recorded the statement, but simultaneously cross-checked his alibi by comparing shift logs, duty assignments, internal station cameras, and statements from colleagues on the same shift. Initial results showed Christopher was present at the station for most of the relevant time, with no official record of him leaving his post. However, some investigators noted that relying on internal records alone was not sufficient to completely rule out other possibilities, as minor activities in the station, such as going to the parking lot, checking equipment, or handling supplies, were sometimes not captured by cameras. Nevertheless, at that point, available documentation still confirmed that Christopher had no prolonged or noticeable absences. When moving to more personal matters, the investigator asked about the current relationship between Christopher and Ava, particularly regarding custody of their daughter. Christopher admitted that there were many disagreements between them after the separation, mainly revolving around scheduling care time, finances, and decision-making related to the child. He said that recent exchanges were often tense, but denied any serious arguments in the days immediately before Ava's disappearance. He described the relationship as uncomfortable but predictable, asserting that both maintained necessary communication for co-parenting and there were no threats or major conflicts. However, when cross-referencing Christopher's statement with what Ava's family and friends had previously provided, the investigation team noticed some minor inconsistencies. While Christopher described the level of tension as normal, Ava's loved ones reported that she often felt anxious after each interaction with him and sometimes avoided direct communication due to feeling pressured. The investigators noted this difference, but could not yet determine if it was merely a perceptual discrepancy or indicative of a larger issue. Additionally, Christopher did not mention Ava's fear of being followed, despite this having been confirmed by her friends. When asked directly, he said he knew nothing about it, and that if Ava had such concerns, she never shared them with him. This was a point that caught the investigators' attention, but was not yet weighty enough to undermine his alibi. At the end of the interview, the investigation team obtained an initial picture of Christopher's role and whereabouts during Ava's disappearance. His alibi was relatively solid based on the fire station's internal data, but the small differences between his statement and information from Ava's loved ones indicated more verification was needed. Although these inconsistencies were recorded in the file, they were not yet sufficient to consider Christopher a suspect, and the investigators had to maintain a neutral stance, focusing on cross-referencing his statement with other case data to determine if any unresolved factors related to Ava's disappearance existed. After completing the interview with Christopher Hale and noting the minor inconsistencies in his statement, the investigation team proceeded to the next step of gathering information from individuals with indirect or direct connections to Ava, notably Declan Moore, a homeless man whom Christopher had previously hired for odd jobs while they lived near the Jesmond area. Information about Declan emerged from statements by Ava's family and friends who had seen him around her home area in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. This prompted police to treat Declan as a priority for early statement collection to clarify whether his presence was related to Ava or merely coincidental. The investigation team located Declan near Central Station, where he frequently hung out. They verified his identity, confirming that Declan had no fixed address, lived precariously through informal jobs, and had assisted Christopher on a few occasions, including yard cleaning or carrying small items. When asked about this relationship, Declan confirmed meeting Christopher a few times and being paid in cash or food, but denied being close or having regular contact. This partially aligned with Christopher's statement, but was not detailed enough to fully describe the nature of their relationship. When the investigation team moved to the main topic, Declan's whereabouts and activities on the night Ava disappeared, Declan replied that he didn't remember clearly because that night was like any other normal night, involving drinking, wandering around the station, and finding a place to sleep. When police pressed for specific timings or people who could confirm his location, Declan became flustered and provided vague, inconsistent descriptions that shifted between the start and end of the interview. These inconsistencies were clearly noted by the investigators. At one point, he said he was in the central station area. At another, he claimed to have slept near a parking lot in Biker, and even denied venturing far from the city center, before later admitting he might have gone toward Ausburn Valley. The changes in his account led police to assess Declan as having unreliable memory or deliberately withholding some information. When confronted about multiple witnesses seeing him near Ava's residence, Declan responded that he went wherever possible, with no specific intent, and that the coincidences were just due to his wandering in a broad area. He also denied ever interacting or speaking with Ava, claiming he didn't know where she worked and had no reason to pay attention to her. When asked about Christopher, Declan described them as casual acquaintances, but could not explain why he appeared multiple times near Ava's residence during the period she felt followed. The investigators recognized that while Declan did not directly provide incriminating information, his statement contained many signs of inconsistency. Each time he was pressed on specific times or locations, Declan answered evasively or changed the subject. However, this lack of consistency could not yet be used as clear evidence, as Declan's lifestyle, unstable, without schedule or corroborators, made detecting lies difficult. The investigation team also had to acknowledge that no camera footage placed Declan in the area where Ava disappeared that night, nor were there witnesses confirming his proximity to Ava at the critical time. Therefore, linking him to Ava's disappearance remained based only on suspicion and indirect details. At the end of the interview, the investigators concluded that Declan Moore could not be detained due to no signs of criminal activity or specific evidence connecting him to the event. However, they clearly noted in the file that Declan exhibited inconsistent statements, had appeared in Ava's living area, had a loose employment relationship with Christopher, and could not verify his own alibi. With these factors, Declan was designated as a person of interest, meaning someone potentially involved, but without sufficient grounds to be considered a suspect, and his file would continue to be monitored alongside other investigative directions. Immediately after completing the initial interview rounds and realizing that neither Christopher Hale nor Declan Moore could provide information to narrow the gap in the timeline before Ava disappeared, the investigation team decided to expand the search scope beyond the main route from Quayside to Jesmond. The evidence found in Ausburn Valley indicated that Ava might have deviated from her usual path, either voluntarily or due to external factors, so limiting the search to the areas around Gray Street and Dean Street was no longer sufficient. The search effort was bolstered by mobilizing SARE units, the Rescue Services diving team, and local community volunteers, people willing to help when a resident goes missing under unusual circumstances. The first area selected for expansion was Jesmond Dene, a wooded valley with a network of trails, small streams, stone bridges, and dense sections. Since this was an area Ava often cut through to shorten her walk home, the possibility that she had been there on the night of her disappearance needed to be ruled out by police. SARE established fan-shaped search lines, sweeping each trail segment, bush, rock crevice, and boundary areas where a pedestrian could slip or fall out of sight. Specialized dog handler teams were deployed to detect any lingering scent traces, but the extended time since Ava's disappearance significantly limited their effectiveness. From Jesmond Dene, the search teams continued expanding into connected parks, such as Heaton Park and Armstrong Park, large, open areas with numerous intersecting minor paths. Volunteers were grouped to scan lawns, sloped walkways, and areas near water channels, but no items or traces potentially linked to Ava were recorded. Meanwhile, the diving and rescue team focused on the River Tyne area, particularly low banks, access bridges, and spots locals considered dangerous at night. Underwater searches were organized by zones, using handheld sonar equipment and side-to-side scanning methods to detect anomalies or unusual objects on the riverbed. However, after many hours of searching, the divers found no signs indicating Ava had fallen into the water or been pushed in. The absence of any clues, despite the significantly expanded scope, led the search to shift toward peripheral areas along the route Ava might have taken. The investigation team urgently examined shortcuts, local footpaths, and lesser-known turnoffs, places that could explain why Ava or her belongings ended up in an area like Ouseburn Valley. Secondary routes connecting Jesmond Dene to Biker, Sandyford, and Ouseburn were thoroughly checked, but the results yielded no new information. Investigators noted that Newcastle's vast area and complex terrain, especially the valleys and green corridors running through the city, created countless possibilities for where Ava might have gone. Even with a large search force, the lack of clear traces made the effort feel like trying to assemble a puzzle with the central piece missing. After completing the multi-day expanded search, the investigation team faced a significant reality: all reasonable areas, from Ava's usual route, parks near her home, to high-risk riverside spots, showed no signs of her having an accident or intentionally hiding. This led to an important internal assessment: Ava had most likely been removed from the route shortly after the last camera sighting. The implication of this conclusion was profound, as it suggested her disappearance was not due to an ordinary accident within her familiar travel range, but rather the result of external intervention occurring in an extremely short window, right after she left the camera-monitored area. The failure to find direct traces in the expanded searches meant that the areas where Ava might have been taken, or the routes others might have used to remove her from the scene, extended far beyond the initial scope. With this conclusion, police were forced to reevaluate all investigative hypotheses and seek new approaches to determine what really happened to Ava in the final minutes before every trace of her vanished from Newcastle that night. After completing the expanded search operations without uncovering any additional valuable traces, the investigation team returned to compiling all data collected in the early phase to reassess the overall picture of Ava Linton's disappearance. They reviewed the CCTV footage from Quayside to Grey Street, cross-referenced it with statements from colleagues, friends, and family, and analyzed the location of the evidence found in Ouseburn Valley. Camera information showed Ava leaving the bar alone, with no one following her in the monitored sections, and walking steadily until she moved out of the final camera's view. Statements from those who knew her indicated Ava had no financial difficulties, no plans to travel, no signs of mental health crisis, and no reason to voluntarily disappear from her daily life. The evidence in Ouseburn Valley, while helping identify a plausible point off her usual route, was not sufficient on its own to confirm criminal activity. There were no signs Ava had been dragged, pushed, struggled, or had an incident there. No witnesses heard cries for help or saw a confrontation that night. All the investigation team had was an abruptly interrupted journey and the appearance of a personal item outside the main route. The failure to locate a body, clear signs of assault, or any physical evidence describing what happened made it extremely difficult for police to determine the nature of the case. If this were a voluntary departure, Ava would likely have left signs, made contact, or had a clear plan for where she intended to go. However, every aspect of Ava's life, from her stable job, family relationships, responsibilities toward her young child, and personal schedule, contradicted this hypothesis. There were no unusual financial transactions, no messages suggesting intent to leave, and no signs of preparation for departing Newcastle. The second hypothesis, an accident, was carefully examined based on the terrain she might have traversed. A pedestrian could slip on a slope, fall to the riverbank, or encounter trouble in dark parks. However, Rescue and SR teams found no accident indicators, no fresh soil slides, no torn clothing caught on branches, no foreign objects in the River Tyne, matching the size of a missing person. They also found no locations showing signs of heavy impact or unusual ground disturbance. The complete lack of physical evidence weakened the accident hypothesis. The third hypothesis, that Ava was the victim of a crime, seemed to fit the sudden timeline cutoff and the personal item appearing in a place she had no reason to visit. However, the investigation team still lacked every element needed to establish a specific offense. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints, no witnesses seeing Ava being approached, and no cameras capturing suspicious individuals in the area at the time of her disappearance. Without a body, police could not determine the form of attack, time of death, or circumstances. There was no weapon, no suspected vehicle, no investigative direction to distinguish between an abduction, a spontaneous assault, or a premeditated act. All three hypotheses, voluntary departure, accident, or foul play, remained theoretically possible, but none had sufficient evidence to be considered stronger than the others. This lack of differentiation prevented the investigation team from focusing on a single direction, leading to a professional judgment impasse. Investigators all recognized that Ava's disappearance could not be easily explained by typical patterns seen in other adult missing persons cases. Instead, every piece of data fell into a gray area, just enough to raise suspicion, but not enough for concrete action. When searches exhausted possibilities and analysis yielded no clear conclusions, the case entered a period of stagnation. This was the point where the investigation team had to acknowledge they had no new leads to pursue, and no evidence strong enough to expand in any clear investigative direction, marking the impasse of the entire initial phase in Ava Linton's disappearance. After 3 months of continuous investigation without meaningful progress, the team handling Ava Linton's disappearance was forced to reassess all resources and the feasibility of continuing to deploy new investigative avenues. The data collected in the early phase, from cameras, statements to evidence, had been analyzed multiple times without uncovering any reliable new branches of information. All field search efforts also yielded no clear results. Meanwhile, the absence of a body, evidence of assault, or witness leads made the case increasingly difficult to maintain at high priority without consuming excessive investigative resources. In this context, Northumbria Police conducted a procedural review in line with standards and concluded that Ava's file needed to be transferred to cold case status, handled by the unit specializing in long stagnant missing persons or criminal cases. This was not a decision to give up, but a strategic adjustment to preserve all data and ensure the file remained ready for reactivation upon new leads or advancements in investigative technology. When transferring the file to the cold case unit, police officially noted in documentation the technical limitations of 2005 that may have impacted investigation quality. CCTV cameras in Newcastle had not been uniformly upgraded, with low resolution and limited coverage, especially at minor intersections and poorly lit areas. This made filling the timeline gap for Ava almost entirely dependent on outdated cameras incapable of clearly capturing fine details or tracking distant movement. Additionally, forensic methods at the time lacked the sophistication for in-depth analysis of evidence from Ouseburn Valley. Many samples were difficult to extract, and fiber traces or soil samples were deemed insufficient during initial evaluation. Furthermore, 2005 cell site location technology was rudimentary, only able to place a phone user within a broad range rather than pinpointing exact small areas in the city. All these limitations, while not diminishing the file's value, prevented the investigation from moving beyond preliminary hypotheses and toward determining the true nature of the disappearance. While police made this technical decision, Ava's family continued every effort to keep the case from fading. They sent letters, contacted police offices, requested reinvestigation, and provided any information they believed could help. The family also joined community search groups, distributing Ava's photos on flyers and local forums in hopes someone had seen or remembered something that could open a new investigative path. However, these efforts brought no significant change, no new witnesses, no reports of additional items found, no supplementary camera data, and most importantly, no evidence Ava remained in the city after the disappearance time. In this context, Ava Linton's file was officially classified as a cold case, stored under strict procedures, and reviewed only periodically or upon new information. Though the family held on to hope and continued speaking out, Ava's disappearance settled into a limbo between community memory and the investigative technology limitations of the era, becoming one of those cases police could neither close nor advance further. Starting from 2006 onward, the missing person case of Ava Linton entered the prolonged and silent phase characteristic of a cold case, as no new leads emerged to push the investigation further. In the early years after the case was reclassified, police continued to receive all information provided by the public, but most of it consisted of scattered reports based on speculation or confusion with other women in the area. None of the information carried enough weight to suggest a new investigative direction or to prove that Ava had appeared anywhere after the night she disappeared. As leads became increasingly scarce, public interest gradually waned, and Ava's disappearance quietly slipped into the list of unsolved cases in Newcastle. For those who had been part of Ava's social circle, their lives also changed over time. Christopher Hale continued his work at the Tyne Wear Fire Station, maintaining a stable life without drawing particular attention. His personnel records from this period show that he worked regularly, encountered no major professional troubles, and had no other legal issues that would prompt police to re-examine him in the context of the disappearance. For someone who had once been the focus of early interviews, Christopher's normal integration into community life meant his file was no longer in the priority monitoring group. In contrast, Declan Moore, the homeless man who had appeared near where Ava lived, gradually vanished from the Newcastle area. From around 2007, police noted that Declan was no longer seen at familiar spots like near Central Station or the streets where he had previously wandered. Local homeless support organizations had no information about him, and social welfare agency records showed no contact with anyone matching his name. Declan's departure from the area was explained as common among those without fixed addresses, and police had no grounds to view his disappearance as suspicious or directly related to Ava's case. Meanwhile, all the evidence collected during the initial investigation phase, including the item found at Ouseburn Valley and the soil and fabric samples gathered from the expanded search area, were carefully stored in the evidence locker but not further analyzed because the forensic technology at the time lacked the capability for deeper exploitation. DNA and trace evidence analysis techniques were not sophisticated enough, leaving many samples, though potentially important, classified as insufficient for examination. Thus, even though they were fully preserved, they could not provide new data to reopen the case. Over nearly a decade, the Cold Case Unit periodically reviewed Ava's file, usually whenever there were changes in procedural protocols or the emergence of a new forensic technique. However, at that time, technological advances were not strong enough to make a significant difference, and Ava's case was often concluded with no new data to continue the investigation. Ava's family, despite efforts to keep attention on the case by contacting the media, distributing flyers, organizing memorial events, and calling for community support, received no responses that could lead to real progress. With each passing year, their hope relied only on the possibility that someone might remember something or that technology would advance enough to retest the old samples. But during the period from 2006 to 2013, all efforts fell into a void, and Ava's disappearance continued to exist as an unsolved mystery, mentioned only in the annual summaries of the Cold Case Unit's reports, where it stood as a file that was open but without a clear path forward. Nearly a decade after Ava Linton disappeared, in early 2014, the long silence surrounding this cold case was broken when a group of workers constructing an underground power line in a sparsely wooded area near Pontland, an area not far from Newcastle but featuring hilly terrain and semi-wild forest patches, reported discovering what they suspected to be human remains. The workers were digging a technical trench to lay cables when the excavator hit a softer layer of soil than usual. Upon checking, a small bone fragment was exposed, prompting the crew to immediately halt work and call Northumbria Police to the scene. When investigators and forensic experts arrived, they cordoned off the area with a wide radius to ensure no disturbance would affect the excavation process. The site was determined to be in a shallow depression, less than 1 meter deep, covered over time by a layer of decayed leaves and thick vegetation. Experienced forensic specialists quickly recognized signs indicating the body had been intentionally buried rather than a natural occurrence. The previously disturbed soil clearly showed the shape of a burial pit, with uneven sedimentation, unlike the surrounding areas, and thick branches placed crisscross on top, as if to initially conceal the location. They also found traces of decomposed fabric, few but enough to indicate the victim was buried clothed rather than nude or dispersed after death. As the careful excavation proceeded, a nearly intact human skeleton was recovered, accompanied by remaining fabric fragments, including parts of a top and pants with faded colors, but still matching the description of the outfit Ava wore the night she went missing. Although the long burial time had destroyed many details, some features remained sufficient to suggest a connection to the nearly 9-year-old cold case. A broken necklace, lying in the damp soil, had a shape similar to the item the family had described. Ava always wearing. Even based on initial observations, investigators noted notable matches between the discovery location, clothing type, and the disappearance context. However, all confirmation had to follow forensic protocol, so the remains were transported to the lab for official analysis. In the forensic lab, experts assessed bone length, anatomical features, and dental condition, determining the victim was an adult woman in the age range matching Ava Linton at the time of disappearance. Bone marks showed no clear cause of death due to prolonged decomposition, but no signs indicated natural causes. In particular, they focused on the upper molars, a detail the family confirmed Ava had orthodontic work on, and compared them to her dental records. The results matched, confirming the victim's identity. The discovery of intentionally buried remains at Pontland was immediately reported to the Northumbria Police Cold Case Unit. With the victim's identity confirmed, Ava Linton's missing person file was reactivated under procedures for cases shifting from missing to suspected criminal elements. The location where the body was found, far from the route Ava had traveled, highlighted the abnormality and showed she could not have reached it on her own. This provided grounds for police to assess that Ava's disappearance no longer fell under hypotheses like voluntary departure or accident, but had shifted to a clearer direction. Someone had taken her to this location and concealed the body to cover up. As information about the remains discovery was confirmed and entered into the investigative file, the entire case immediately moved out of its years-long stasis. Investigators, who for nearly a decade could only review old data without breakthroughs, now faced a completely new piece of the puzzle, one that changed the entire nature of the case. Since the body location was outside the initial search perimeter, this raised questions about the means, timing, and person capable of transporting Ava to the Pontland forest near the disappearance date. Although camera systems on routes leading to the area in 2005 were insufficient to capture all movements, the body discovery opened a new line of analysis. The victim had been moved from the initial scene shortly after disappearing. Victim identification through personal characteristics not only provided official confirmation for the family, but also legal grounds for police to shift the case from missing person to a suspected homicide involving body concealment. This meant all 2005 data, from statements, evidence, to the final timeline, now had to be re-examined in the new context. When the forensic conclusion was sent to the cold case unit, Ava Linton's file, dormant for nearly 9 years, was fully reopened and shifted to active investigation status. The Pontland event became a pivotal marker, pulling the case out of the shadows of time and placing it back at the center of Northumbria Police investigative priorities. After the remains were confirmed to be Ava Linton, Northumbria Police immediately transferred the entire cold case file to the active investigation team and took the most critical step, reanalyzing all evidence collected in 2005 using the more advanced forensic technology of 2014. Significant developments in DNA analysis, trace particle processing, and material comparison techniques over nearly a decade allowed the forensic team to exploit samples previously deemed insufficient for examination, potentially opening entirely new investigative directions. One of the first samples reprocessed was the evidence from Ouspern Valley, the personal item of Ava's found during the initial search. In 2005, analysis technology lacked the sensitivity to separate complex DNA forms adhering to weather-exposed material surfaces. But with new generation extraction and amplification techniques, the lab could peel away layers of trace substances, eliminate environmental noise, and focus on biologically derived molecules. The results showed, besides DNA matching Ava, traces of DNA from another individual, and after comparison with police database samples, it matched Declan Moore's profile. This match not only confirmed Declan had direct contact with the evidence, but also aligned with records of his frequent appearances near Ava's residence before her disappearance. More importantly, the DNA trace was positioned in a way suggesting it was likely left near the disappearance date rather than from earlier normal interactions in the context of knowing Christopher. This was the first breakthrough result, creating a clear shift in the assessment of Declan Moore. Next, the forensic team reanalyzed fabric fibers collected from Ava's clothing, samples carefully gathered but unusable in 2005 due to equipment lacking resolution for origin determination. In 2014, experts used spectral analysis and microscopic comparison to identify fiber structure, material, and remaining faded color properties. Results showed some fibers on Ava's top and pants matched the upholstery material used in the Ford Focus model owned by Christopher Hale at the time of her disappearance. This match was particularly notable because no statements from Christopher or Ava's family indicated she had been in his car near the disappearance time. On the contrary, prior information showed their relationship was strained with very limited direct contact. Thus, the presence of Christopher's car, upholstery fibers on Ava's clothing, could not be seen as from normal interaction, but more likely indicated Ava had been in his car, willingly or not, during the disappearance window. Alongside these two key analysis results, the forensic team also studied soil samples from the remains and the Pontland burial site. Although long burial had mixed the soil with new sediments, using micromineral analysis and regional soil structure comparison, experts determined the soil adhering to Ava's clothing and bones shared characteristics with certain Newcastle areas, particularly one recorded as where Christopher was present the night Ava disappeared, based on duty rosters and internal fire station notes. This comparison suggested Ava likely contacted that area before the body was taken to the Pontland burial site. This was valuable as it narrowed the death and transport timeline, reinforcing that Ava was moved very quickly after disappearing, rather than days later as some had speculated early on. Beyond soil and fibers, the forensic team also re-examined prior trace particle samples. Some, previously excluded due to unclear origin, now under electron microscopy, showed matches with synthetic materials, commonly in car trunks. This suggested the body or clothing had contacted a vehicle's cargo space before burial. When combining the forensic data, Declan Moore's DNA on the evidence, Christopher Hale's car upholstery fibers on the victim's clothing, soil linked to Christopher's location, and trace particles matching trunk materials, the investigation team could build a more reliable interpretive model than the entire initial phase. The model indicated Ava was removed from her usual route shortly after her last camera appearance, had contact with Christopher's vehicle, and the body was buried very near the disappearance date. The forensic traces did not answer who directly caused harm to Ava, but provided a solid foundation for concluding the case could not be an accident or voluntary departure, but was intentional intervention by one or more individuals. From a professional standpoint, the team reached a critical conclusion. Ava did not simply vanish from the route suddenly. Her body was moved from the initial scene shortly after disappearance and buried to conceal the crime. This was the first conclusion since the case began, with the power to redirect the entire investigation, paving the way for deeper inquiries into the roles of involved individuals, particularly Christopher Hale and Declan Moore, whose names repeatedly appeared in the file from the earliest days of Ava's disappearance. The emergence of new forensic results, particularly Declan Moore's DNA on the evidence collected in 2005, along with trace particle samples linked to the interior of Christopher Hale's vehicle, led the investigation team to conclude that the most appropriate time had arrived to conduct a second interrogation with Declan. After nearly a decade since the initial interview, Declan was no longer a vague figure on the periphery of the case. Scientific evidence had officially placed him at the center. When summoned, Declan appeared more cautious than he had years earlier, but he no longer maintained the indifferent attitude from the first session. The police's clear and systematic presentation of the forensic results made Declan understand that his contradictions or don't remember responses no longer held any value. The investigator began by showing photographs of the evidence recovered in Alsburn Valley and the DNA report, confirming that Declan had direct contact with the item very close to the date Ava disappeared. Declan initially denied that his DNA was related to the time of the disappearance, but when explained the degree of degradation and how molecular analysis indicated the timing of adhesion, he became flustered. Next, the investigator presented the trace fiber analysis from Ava's clothing matching Christopher's vehicle interior, information not directly related to Declan, but serving to force him to confront the possibility of being viewed as an accomplice if he continued to withhold information. When asked about the reason his DNA appeared on the first evidence item linked to Ava, Declan hesitated at length before responding that perhaps while working for Christopher he had touched items related to it. But this did not align with the location where the evidence was found, and the investigator immediately pointed out the contradiction. As the interrogation shifted to comparing timelines, Declan gradually lost the ability to maintain his previous stance. The investigator presented a summary timeline from 2005, including the time Ava finished her shift, the last camera footage of her, and the evidence location, and required Declan to explain the coincidence of him having appeared in the area around Ava's home at the exact time she felt stalked. This was the point that caused Declan to begin changing his statement. After a long silence, he admitted that in the period before Ava's disappearance, Christopher had asked him to observe Ava, follow where she went after her shift, and report back. Declan described this request as an informal part-time job, paid by Christopher in cash or food. He said Christopher wanted to know whether Ava was meeting anyone and whether she was bringing anyone home. This was the first time Declan admitted direct involvement in stalking Ava. When the investigator probed deeper into the scope of the surveillance, Declan stated that Christopher sometimes instructed him to stand at advantageous points for observation, near the turnoff along Grey Street, the Jesmond Dene area, and some small segments leading to Alsburn Valley. When asked if Christopher had explained the reason for wanting to follow Ava, Declan said Christopher provided no specific reason, only stating that he needed to ensure Ava wasn't doing anything dangerous to the family. This explanation, as described by Declan, led him to believe it was merely a form of personal monitoring out of jealousy or concern, not a task related to criminal behavior. However, the investigator immediately pointed out the absurdity of Declan repeatedly appearing at points where Ava had noticed someone following her. When pressed with questions, he no longer denied his role. The turning point came when the investigator directly asked about the night Ava disappeared. This was the point Declan had tried to avoid for nearly an hour of the interview. But when presented with the forensic results on soil adhering to the body, showing Ava's connection to an area where Christopher had been present, Declan realized that continuing to conceal would make him appear as the primary responsible party. After a tense moment, he sighed and said that on the night Ava disappeared, Christopher had sought him out in the area near Ausburn. According to this new account, Christopher instructed Declan to stand at a small intersection where Ava might pass when leaving the main road, and to signal if he saw her appear. Declan described his task as following Ava from a distance, confirming she had left the camera-covered area and moved toward a less populated region. The investigator asked Declan if he had direct contact with Ava that night, and after a few seconds of hesitation, he admitted to seeing Ava turn into a darker area, but denied touching her or trying to stop her. However, he admitted to seeing Christopher appear shortly afterward and described that Christopher seemed to know Ava would go in that direction. When asked to describe in more detail, Declan said Christopher had told him beforehand about needing to talk to Ava and that on that evening, Christopher appeared very tense and agitated. He emphasized that Christopher told him only to observe and then leave without participating in any other action. The investigator continued to probe deeper into the hiring arrangement. This time, Declan clarified that Christopher had paid him multiple times to monitor Ava's movements, especially on evenings when she finished late shifts. The purpose of the surveillance, according to Declan's statement, was to ensure Christopher knew if Ava was meeting anyone and see which route she took home. When confronted about why Christopher needed this information, Declan only replied that he didn't ask because he didn't want to get involved in their personal matters. Under pressure from the forensic evidence and the logic of the timeline, Declan finally admitted that he acted as an intermediary in monitoring Ava, but insisted he had no prior knowledge of what would happen after Christopher approached her that night. What the interrogation yielded was not only a change in statement, but also an official admission that there was contact among all three, Ava, Declan, and Christopher, within the same time frame on the night Ava disappeared. Although Declan tried to maintain that his role stopped at monitoring and signaling, this statement shifted the investigation into an entirely different phase. It eliminated the possibility that Declan was merely coincidentally in the area while placing Christopher at the center of the events on the night Ava disappeared, a position previously only speculated through minor contradictions in statements but never confirmed by a direct witness. Declan Moore's change in statement and admission of his role in stalking Ava at Christopher Hale's request forced the investigation team to revisit the entire alibi Christopher had provided since 2005, an alibi once considered solid based on records at the Tyne Wear Fire Station. But now, with forensic evidence indicating Ava's contact with Christopher's vehicle interior, along with the new statement showing Christopher actively sought to meet Ava on the night she disappeared, the team needed to re-examine all timelines related to his shift. The first step was to review the fire station's logbook, which recorded details of shift start and end times, internal activities, and task assignments for each duty period. Upon reviewing the records for Christopher's shift on the night Ava disappeared, investigators noted a nearly 1-hour gap with no entries describing his exact location. This gap had previously been overlooked because there was no evidence Christopher left the station, but now, in the context of the new statement and forensic traces, it became a notable anomaly. Normally, a firefighter on duty must remain at the station unless dispatched for a specific task, but that night there were no dispatch reports involving Christopher. When cross-referenced with his 2005 statement that he was present at the station throughout the shift, the logbook gap became the first sign that his account might not have been truthful. For further verification, the team turned to analyzing location data from fire vehicle tracking devices. Although 2005 technology was not as advanced as today, many fire engines were equipped with basic movement recording systems for managing routes during dispatches. Upon checking the data for the vehicle assigned to Christopher's shift crew, the team unexpectedly discovered a short but unusual sequence of movements occurring exactly during the logbook gap. According to the data, the fire engine moved away from its parking spot in the station yard, traveled a short distance, and returned in under an hour. The anomaly was that no official record explained the vehicle's use during that time, and there were no emergency calls requiring dispatch. This meant the vehicle had been moved outside of duty, and more importantly, only on-duty personnel with access could unlock it. When aligning this time frame with Declan's statement that Christopher met him in the area near Ausburn on the night Ava disappeared, the team began to see clear compatibility among the facts. During the period the vehicle left the station, Christopher fully had the opportunity to meet Declan, follow Ava's route, or approach her at a point without camera coverage. However, the team needed additional independent data to solidify this conclusion. Therefore, they returned to the old CCTV footage collected in 2005 from stores around the Biker and Sandyford areas, regions. Declan had stated Christopher took him to buy tools for work. In 2005, this CCTV was deemed too unclear and unusable for identification in court. But with 2014 enhancements in brightness and image quality improvement technology, the Image Analysis Lab could produce improved versions of the overlooked footage. Upon restoration, investigators noted a frame showing two men entering a tool store just days before Ava's disappearance. They examined each frame, adjusting contrast and enlarging key details. The analysis yielded a notable conclusion: the build, height, and facial features of one man matched Christopher Hale. The accompanying individual had characteristics consistent with Declan Moore. Both appeared in an area neither had mentioned in their initial interrogations. This CCTV data could not reveal their purpose, but their joint appearance at the tool store created a suspicious chain of coincidences. Their collaboration in the days leading up to the disappearance completely contradicted the initial statements of both, that their relationship was merely loose acquaintance with no joint activities. When the leads from the logbook, vehicle data, Declan's new statement, and enhanced CCTV were pieced together, a behavioral pattern became clear. Christopher had the opportunity to leave the fire station without record, had means for quick travel, had direct contact with Declan at the time of the disappearance, and had links to forensic evidence on Ava's body and clothing. Compiling these facts showed that Christopher's alibi, considered valid for nearly a decade, no longer held up against new scientific evidence and data analysis. The logbook gap could no longer be seen as an oversight, but became the pivotal point reframing the entire story of Christopher's location on the night Ava disappeared. The unusual vehicle movement further clarified the possibility he left the station, while the enhanced CCTV showed coordination between Christopher and Declan near the time of the crime. As all these new pieces were added to the updated file, the investigation team agreed that Christopher Hale's alibi had officially lost validity. No longer just the ex-husband indirectly involved through personal ties, Christopher became the primary suspect in the case, a position determined not merely by inference, but by a chain of specific, independent, and verifiable evidence. As the chain of evidence strengthened to the point of showing Christopher Hale not only had opportunity but also motive and means to intervene in Ava Linton's final journey, the investigation team concluded there was sufficient legal basis to seek an arrest warrant. Although much of the evidence was circumstantial, the combination of forensics, fire vehicle data, the logbook gap, Declan's new statement, and enhanced CCTV formed a unified logical structure meeting the requirements for a serious criminal case. Northumbria Police submitted all documents to the prosecutor, accompanied by a detailed analysis of the connections between timelines and collected traces. After review, the arrest warrant for Christopher Hale was approved with initial charges related to deprivation of liberty and suspicion of causing Ava Linton's death. As soon as the warrant was signed, the arrest team proceeded to plan in detail to ensure the process was safe and left no opportunity for Christopher to destroy documents or flee. Since Christopher was a former firefighter with knowledge of emergency response procedures, police determined a surprise approach was needed to limit resistance or escape. The chosen time was early morning, when Christopher was typically home with minimal movement. The tactical team approached Christopher's residence on Sunderland Road, where he lived alone in a two-story rented house from a local family. As forces neared, they divided into three groups, one blocking the front, one securing the rear emergency exit, and the main group ready to approach the front door to announce the arrest warrant. Christopher was awakened by loud knocking, and upon opening the door, he faced officers loudly reading the arrest warrant per legal procedure. Initially, he appeared confused, then tense upon hearing Ava's name mentioned again. However, unlike some suspects who attempt to flee or argue, Christopher remained silent, allowing officers to escort and handcuff him before placing him in the transport vehicle. While the tactical team handled the arrest, the search team simultaneously executed the search warrant, approved concurrently with the arrest. They thoroughly checked all spaces in the house: bedroom, living areas, garage, and a small storage area at the rear. All paper documents, personal notebooks, old work schedules, and any materials related to finances, travel, or communications were seized for analysis. Items with potential forensic comparison, such as clothing, shoes, hand tools, work gloves, were sealed in evidence bags. A key part of the search was seizing Christopher's personal vehicle, the Ford Focus, previously noted in 2005 files but never thoroughly searched due to lack of strong legal grounds, now became a central exhibit for examination. The car was loaded onto a tow truck and taken directly to the police forensic garage. All interior surfaces, rear seats, trunk, floor mats, seat crevices, would be reanalyzed using modern forensic technology to compare with fabric traces found on Ava's clothing. Additionally, police seized electronic devices, current phone, old storage devices, desktop hard drives, and a powered-off laptop. This data, even if deleted, could be recovered in the digital lab to trace back behavior, routes, and contacts in the days surrounding the disappearance. The entire search process was filmed and documented step by step to ensure legality for court use. As the vehicle carrying Christopher left the house, officers agreed that the most significant turning point in the case since 2005 had officially occurred. This arrest was not based on mere suspicion, but the result of nearly 8 months of reinvestigation since Ava's body was found in Pontland. With Christopher Hale in custody, the case file moved to a new phase, where all prior data, from statement contradictions to forensic evidence, would be verified step by step to determine his true role on the night Ava disappeared. After Christopher Hale was arrested and all the physical evidence was transferred to the analysis room, the Ava Linton case file was forwarded to the Crown Prosecution Service to prepare for the formal prosecution stage. This is a critical phase, where the CPS must construct a complete event model from the disparate pieces of evidence accumulated over nearly a decade, in order to prove in court that Christopher's actions were intentional, planned, and directly led to Ava's death. The prosecutors began by establishing the chain of motive. They examined the long-standing tensions between Christopher and Ava, particularly regarding child custody disputes, a theme that emerged in the testimonies of Ava's family and friends, as well as through minor inconsistencies in Christopher's initial interview. The CPS analyzed that Christopher's control and jealousy appeared to escalate over time, and his hiring of Declan to surveil Ava for weeks prior to her disappearance indicated a pattern of behavior that was not impulsive but sustained. This formed the basis for proving underlying motive, even without direct evidence of threats or arguments immediately before the incident. Next, the CPS built the surveillance model, a key element in demonstrating that this was premeditated conduct rather than a spontaneous situation. Declan Moore's new testimony revealed that Christopher had repeatedly asked him to position himself at strategic points along Ava's commute home from Grey Street to near Jesmond Dene. The CPS bolstered this testimony with forensic data, Declan's DNA on the evidence, trace particles indicating Ava had been in Christopher's vehicle, and soil samples from Pontland matching the area where Christopher was present that night. Cross-referencing the testimony with physical evidence was essential to ensure the argument could withstand challenges from the defense attorney. From the surveillance model, the CPS moved to the approach model. Here, they pieced together the timeline of the night Ava disappeared based on CCTV footage, Declan's testimony, and analysis of the fire station logbook. The last CCTV sighting of Ava was at the head of Grey Street, after which she vanished from view during a time frame that overlapped with a 1-hour unaccounted gap in Christopher's shift logbook. Simultaneously, data from the fire engine's tracking device showed unusual movement away from the station. The CPS argued that this was evidence Christopher was off station at the exact time Ava disappeared, aligning with Declan's testimony about meeting Christopher in the Ausburn area that night. From approach to victim transport, the CPS continued modeling the process. Traces of Christopher's vehicle interior fibers on Ava's clothing formed the foundation for proving the victim had been in the suspect's car. Although the exact timing could not be pinpointed, forensics showed the fibers adhered through strong friction, consistent with the victim being forced into the vehicle rather than mere brief contact. At the same time, soil on the remains indicated Ava had contact with an area near Newcastle before the body was buried in Pontland. The CPS contended that this suggested the body was moved through multiple locations, an initial contact point, likely near where Christopher worked or where he approached Ava, before being taken to Pontland for burial. The burial of the body, according to the CPS, could not have been an unprepared impulsive act. The grave was clearly shaped, the body intentionally covered, and the location deep in the woods, far from main roads. This required time and means, reinforcing the argument that only someone with knowledge of the terrain or suitable transportation could have carried it out on the night of the disappearance. With the event model reconstructed, the CPS began comparing the statements of Declan and Christopher. In all interrogations, Christopher maintained complete denial of involvement, claiming he never left the station and had no contact with Ava that night. In contrast, Declan's new testimony described a clear sequence. Christopher proactively arranged the surveillance, instructed Declan to monitor Ava's route, arranged to meet him that night, and appeared in the area near where Ava left CCTV view. The CPS did not rely solely on testimony, but cross-checked every detail with objective data: the logbook gap, fire engine movements, forensics on Ava's clothing, and the personal relationships among the three. When the two statements were placed side by side, Christopher's inconsistencies became glaring. If he never left the station, why the vehicle movement? If he had no contact with Declan, why Declan's DNA on evidence and CCTV showing them purchasing tools together? If he never approached Ava, why his vehicle interior fibers on the victim's remains? Each contradiction in Christopher's account was linked by the CPS to an independent piece of evidence, creating a tightly woven argument that could easily withstand rebuttal. After completing the analysis, the CPS moved to preparing courtroom arguments. The prosecutors drafted the indictment clarifying that, although there was no direct eyewitness to the act of taking Ava's life, the model of circumstantial evidence formed a powerful logical chain. They argued that Christopher had a clear motive tied to personal control and family disputes. He surveilled Ava for weeks before her disappearance. He had the opportunity to approach her at the exact moment she vanished from CCTV. He had the means to transport the victim with direct forensic links. The body was buried in a manner indicating not accident but concealment. The CPS anticipated arguing that, despite no video or direct witness, this chain of evidence was equivalent in value, as each part was reinforced by forensics or physical data, and most importantly, could not be reasonably explained unless Christopher was responsible. Additionally, the CPS prepared rebuttals to common defense strategies, including denying intent, blaming Declan, questioning forensic certainty, or claiming events were mere coincidence. They planned to use Declan's testimony combined with forensics to prove Declan could not have acted alone, and that all data pointed to one central figure: Christopher's presence and actions on that night in 2005. When the prosecution file was complete, the CPS concluded they had built an event model strong enough for court, one that not only recounted what happened, but proved who caused Ava Linton never to return. The trial of Christopher Hale and Declan Moore opened amid great public interest in Newcastle, where Ava Linton's disappearance had left a void lasting nearly a decade. At trial, the prosecutor presented the full chain of circumstantial and forensic evidence constructed in the prosecution file, from Christopher's clear motive tied to personal conflicts, to hiring Declan to surveil Ava for weeks, from the logbook gap on the night Ava vanished, to unusual fire engine movement data, from Declan's DNA on evidence to Christopher's vehicle interior fibers on the victim's clothing, and finally soil traces showing Ava was moved before burial in Pontland. Each fact was presented with detailed forensic analysis to prove the pieces could not stand alone, but formed a consistent event chain, with Christopher at the center. The defense attempted to break this logic by arguing the evidence lacked directness, and that Declan could have been solely responsible, but prosecutors countered by highlighting inconsistencies in Christopher's statements, his presence at key timeline points, and forensic links with no reasonable innocent explanation. Regarding Declan, the CPS pointed out he did not directly cause Ava's death, but assisted Christopher through surveillance, monitoring, and years of silence, aiding concealment. As the jury deliberated, their focus was the consistency of the event model, whether the forensic chain testimony and objective data created a more reasonable story than any alternative hypothesis. They considered possibilities of Ava leaving voluntarily, accident, or Declan acting alone, but no hypothesis fully explained the vehicle fibers, engine movement, logbook gap and burial location, kilometers off Ava's route. After hours of consideration, the jury concluded the prosecution's chain was consistent, reasonable, and most convincing. Returning to court, the foreperson announced the verdict: Christopher Hale, guilty of murder and kidnapping, based on evidence he proactively approached, restrained and transported Ava before causing her death, then buried the body to conceal the crime. For Declan Moore, the court recognized his supporting role through surveillance and information concealment, convicting him of assisting an offender. This verdict closed nearly a decade of a case suspended in doubt and insufficient evidence, finally placing criminal responsibility on those who created the tragic chain leading to Ava Linton's death. The sentences for Christopher Hale and Declan Moore triggered strong reactions in the Newcastle community, where Ava Linton's 2005 disappearance had been one of the most heartbreaking mysteries. Many residents expressed relief that the case finally had resolution, but also shock at the calculated nature and near-decade of concealment. Community groups in Jesmond and Quayside held small memorials, recalling Ava as part of shared memory, while local media analyzed how the case reflected hidden risks in tense personal relationships. For Ava's family, the verdict could not erase the loss, but provided necessary closure for recovery. Ava's mother and sister founded an advocacy group to raise awareness of missing persons cases, focusing on supporting families in searches, connecting with volunteer groups, and encouraging reports of unusual stalking. They emphasized that if Ava's concerns about being followed had been taken more seriously at the time, the story might have ended differently. Their group quickly gained attention, becoming a support for families with missing loved ones in the area. Northumbria Police, after reviewing the nearly 10-year investigation, released a report highlighting the importance of modern forensic technology in solving cold cases. Techniques unavailable in 2005, such as trace DNA analysis, low-quality CCTV enhancement, or fiber origin determination via spectroscopy, proved pivotal in untangling knots. Police also acknowledged early limitations: fragmented CCTV, imprecise cell site data, and crude evidence analysis tools, causing clues to be undervalued or unusable. From this, they implemented improved missing persons protocols, emphasizing tracking domestic violence signs, controlling behavior, and high-risk relationships in unexplained cases. The report became a key reference for similar cases, highlighting that the smallest evidence, a fiber, soil sample, blurry CCTV, when reassembled with proper technology, can change a case entirely. As the Ava Linton file officially closed, mixed feelings of belated justice and lingering pain remained evident in the community. But the truth was confirmed: criminal accountability concluded, and Ava's memory preserved as a reminder that every disappearance must be heard, pursued, and never forgotten, even when time tries to silence it. The story of the Ava Linton case is not just a personal tragedy, but reflects very real challenges in modern UK life, especially in urban communities like Newcastle, Manchester, or London, where people can easily become isolated amid fast-paced living and welfare systems, sometimes missing early warnings. Ava's case shows the danger of controlling and stalking behavior in personal relationships. Despite no prior physical violence, Christopher secretly hiring Declan to follow Ava was controlling conduct, now recognized under UK law as serious abuse and prosecutable. If the community, colleagues, or Ava herself had accessed safety support earlier, she might have been better protected. Thus, the lesson is not to dismiss feelings of being followed, controlled, or suspicious behavior changes in former intimates. These can signal greater risk. Additionally, the case underscores the importance of modern forensic technology and UK investment in high-quality CCTV for solving cold cases. Tiny fibers, trace soil, or old meaningless CCTV became keys nearly a decade later. This reminds us of the role of data preservation, timely reporting of minor incidents, and cooperating with authorities even if unsure of information's importance. Finally, Ava's story reminds that UK communities today must maintain the tradition of looking out for each other, watching, caring, and reporting anomalies when someone is repeatedly followed, seen with suspicious individuals, or suddenly changes routine. Community vigilance, combined with law and technology, will create better protection for people like Ava, those who sometimes don't realize they're in danger until too late. Thank you for following the nearly decade-long investigation journey of the Ava Linton case. If you found the story helpful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future true crime analyses. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring cases thought forgotten but holding profound lessons for today.